The Friday night crowd at Le Jardin restaurant was buzzing with excitement. This wasn't just any ordinary restaurant. It was the kind of place where movie stars came to eat, where business deals worth millions were made over expensive wine, and where every table cost more than most people made in a week. The crystal lights hanging from the ceiling cast a warm golden glow over everything. Fresh flowers sat on every table, and the smell of gourmet food filled the air. In one corner of the restaurant stood a beautiful black grand piano that gleamed under the soft lighting. Most nights it sat silent like a sleeping giant, waiting for someone special enough to wake it up. Moving between the tables with practiced grace was a young woman named Lily Chen. At 26 years old, she had been working at Le Jardin for almost 3 years. Her black hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore the restaurant's elegant uniform with pride, even though it reminded her every day of how far she was from her real dreams. Lily had a secret that none of the wealthy customers knew about. Before she started carrying plates and taking orders, she had been one of the most promising young pianists in the city. Her fingers, which now held wine glasses and expensive plates, once danced across piano keys with the skill of someone who had trained for years at the best music schools. But life has a way of changing plans. 3 years ago, everything fell apart when her father suddenly died in a car accident. The funeral costs, combined with her mother's growing medical bills, meant that Lily had to make a choice. She could either continue chasing her dream of becoming a concert pianist, or she could get a job that paid enough money to keep her family afloat. The choice wasn't really a choice at all, so she hung up her dreams, sold her beloved piano that her father had bought her for her 18th birthday, and took a job at the fanciest restaurant she could find. The tips were good, and the steady paycheck meant her mother could get the medicine she needed for her heart condition. Tonight was like most Friday nights. The restaurant was packed with the usual crowd of successful business people, celebrities trying to stay out of the spotlight, and wealthy couples celebrating anniversaries or closing big deals. Lily knew many of them by name now, knew what they liked to drink, knew which tables they preferred, and knew how to make them feel like they were the most important people in the world. As she moved from table to table, refilling water glasses and taking orders, Lily's mind wandered like it often did. She found herself humming quietly under her breath, a habit she had picked up during her piano-playing days. Tonight, the melody flowing through her head was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece she had performed dozens of times in her younger days. The music in her head was so clear and beautiful that for a moment, she forgot where she was. She forgot about the heavy plates in her hands, forgot about the tired ache in her feet from standing for hours, forgot about the bills waiting at home. In her mind, she was back at the piano, lost in the world where she truly belonged. In the far corner of the restaurant, at the most expensive table in the house, sat a man who had been watching Lily with growing curiosity. His name was Richard Blackstone, and he was the kind of person whose name appeared in financial magazines and business newspapers. At 42 years old, he had built a technology company from nothing into an empire worth over $50 million. Richard was known for two things in the business world. First, he had an incredible ability to spot talent and potential in people that others overlooked. Second, he had a reputation for being unpredictable, sometimes doing things that seemed crazy, but always had a method behind the madness. Tonight, he was having dinner with 3 potential investors from Japan who were considering putting money into his latest project. The deal they were discussing could change his company forever, but Richard found himself distracted by something else entirely. He had noticed the young waitress humming, and his trained ear had immediately recognized the complexity of the melody she was unconsciously creating. Richard had studied music before he got into technology, and he still played piano as a hobby. He knew good music when he heard it, and what was coming from this waitress was not just good, it was exceptional. As Lily approached his table to refill their wine glasses, Richard found himself studying her more carefully. There was something about the way she moved, something about the rhythm in her steps that suggested a musical background. When she leaned over to pour the wine, he could hear her humming even more clearly, and he was amazed by what he heard. The melody she was humming was not simple. It was a complex classical piece that most people wouldn't even know, let alone be able to hum with such perfect pitch and timing. Richard felt a familiar excitement building in his chest, the same feeling he got when he discovered a promising new technology or met someone with exceptional talent. Excuse me, he said quietly as Lily finished pouring the wine. She looked up, slightly startled to be addressed directly by such an important customer. Yes, sir? Is everything all right with your meal? She asked politely, her professional smile never wavering. The piece you were humming, Richard said, his eyes studying her face carefully. Chopin, wasn't it? Lily felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She hadn't realized she had been humming loud enough for anyone to hear, especially not loud enough for a customer to notice. I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean to disturb you. It won't happen again. No, Richard said quickly, raising his hand to stop her apology. Please don't apologize. I was just curious. Do you play piano? The question hit Lily like a physical blow. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The simple question brought back a flood of memories that she had spent 3 years trying to keep buried. Images flashed through her mind of countless hours spent practicing, of her father sitting proudly in the audience at her recitals, of the acceptance letter to the music conservatory that still sat in a drawer at home, unopened and unread. I used to, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard noticed the change in her expression immediately. The polite professional smile had disappeared, replaced by something much more complex. He saw pain there and loss and something else that looked like deep, unresolved longing. Used to? He pressed gently, his business instincts telling him there was a much bigger story here. Lily glanced around nervously, aware that she was spending too much time at one table and that her manager might notice. I really should get back to work, sir. Can I get you anything else? But Richard wasn't ready to let this conversation end. There was something about this young woman that had captured his attention completely, and he had learned to trust his instincts about people. Those instincts were telling him that he was looking at someone truly special, someone whose story was far more interesting than it appeared on the surface. What's your name? He asked. Lily, sir. Well, Lily, I have a feeling we're going to have a very interesting conversation before this evening is over. As Lily walked away to attend to her other tables, Richard found himself unable to focus on the business discussion happening around him. His mind was spinning with possibilities and questions. How does someone go from humming complex classical music with perfect pitch to waiting tables? What kind of story lay behind the sadness he had seen in her eyes when he asked about piano playing? The Japanese investors were still talking about market projections and profit margins, but Richard was thinking about something entirely different. He was thinking about talent and opportunity, and the strange way that life sometimes puts exactly the right people in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. As the evening wore on, Richard continued to watch Lily as she worked. He noticed things that other customers probably missed. He saw how she moved with an unusual grace, how her hands remained steady even when carrying multiple plates, how she seemed to hear and respond to sounds and rhythms that others ignored. Most importantly, he noticed that she was still humming, though much more quietly now. The melodies changed throughout the evening, flowing from one classical piece to another, with seamless transitions that spoke of years of serious musical training. By the time dessert was served, Richard had made a decision. He wasn't exactly sure what he was going to do, but he knew that this evening was going to end with something much more interesting than just another business dinner. The stage was set for something unexpected, something that would change multiple lives in ways that no one could have predicted. Sometimes the most important moments in life begin with something as simple as a hummed melody and a curious question. As the clock moved toward 10 p.m. and the restaurant began to quiet down slightly, Richard looked once more at the beautiful grand piano sitting silent in the corner. Then he looked at Lily, who was clearing dishes from a nearby table, still humming softly to herself. An idea was forming in his mind, an idea that was either brilliant or completely crazy. Knowing Richard Blackstone, it was probably both. The restaurant had settled into its late evening rhythm. Most of the dinner crowd had finished their main courses and were now lingering over dessert and coffee, their conversations flowing as smoothly as the expensive wine that filled their glasses. The soft jazz music that had been playing in the background had ended, leaving the dining room filled with the gentle sounds of clinking silverware and quiet laughter. Richard Blackstone sat back in his chair, only half listening as his Japanese business partners discussed the finer details of their potential investment. His attention kept drifting to Lily, who was now moving between tables with practiced efficiency. clearing plates and refilling coffee cups. Every few minutes he caught fragments of the melodies she was humming, and each time he was more impressed by the complexity and beauty of what he heard. It was during the dessert course that Richard noticed something that made him sit up straighter in his chair. Lily was cleaning a table near the piano when she suddenly stopped what she was doing. She stood there for a moment completely still, staring at the beautiful instrument with an expression that took Richard's breath away. It was the look of someone seeing a lost love after years of separation. There was longing in her eyes and pain, and a deep sadness that seemed to come from somewhere very far inside her soul. Her hand moved unconsciously toward the piano, her fingers making small movements in the air as if they were remembering something precious. Then, just as quickly as the moment had come, it passed. Lily shook her head slightly as if waking up from a dream, and went back to clearing the table. But Richard had seen enough. In that brief moment, he had witnessed something that confirmed everything his instincts had been telling him. This young woman wasn't just someone who had once taken piano lessons. She was a real musician, someone for whom music wasn't just a hobby but a fundamental part of who she was, and for some reason, she had been forced to give it up. Richard made his decision. He waited until Lily approached their table to offer the dessert menu. As she stood there politely explaining the evening's special desserts, Richard interrupted her mid-sentence. "Lily," he said, his voice carrying easily to the nearby tables. "I have a question for you." She paused, slightly confused by the interruption. "Yes, sir?" Richard stood up, and his movement caused several people at neighboring tables to look over curiously. When Richard Blackstone stood up in a restaurant, people tended to pay attention. "That piano over there," he said, pointing to the grand piano in the corner. "Do you think you could play something on it?" The question hit Lily like a thunderbolt. Her professional smile faltered, and for a moment she just stared at him in shock. Excuse me, sir?" "It's a simple question," Richard continued, his voice growing louder and more confident. "Can you play piano?" By now their conversation was attracting serious attention from other diners. The Japanese investors at Richard's table looked puzzled, unsure of what their host was doing. At the tables around them, well-dressed men and women had stopped their own conversations to listen. Lily felt her face burning with embarrassment. Being the center of attention was the last thing she wanted, especially when it involved the part of her life that she had worked so hard to leave behind. "Sir, I'm working right now," she said quietly, hoping to end the conversation before it went any further. "Perhaps we could discuss this another time." But Richard wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. He had spent his entire career learning to recognize potential when he saw it, and he was absolutely certain that he was looking at something extraordinary. "Actually, I'd like to make this more interesting," he announced, his voice now loud enough for half the restaurant to hear clearly. "I'll bet you $1,000 that you can't play a single piece on that piano." The effect of his words was immediate and dramatic. Conversations at nearby tables stopped completely as people turned to stare. Lily felt the blood drain from her face as she realized that dozens of eyes were now focused on her. "Mr. Blackstone," she whispered, using his name for the first time as she recognized him from newspaper photos. "Please, I can't or won't," Richard challenged, his eyes sparkling with mischief. $1,000, Lily. All you have to do is sit down at that piano and play one song." The restaurant manager, Tony Marcelli, had noticed the commotion and was hurrying over to see what was happening. Tony was a nervous man in his 50s who had spent his entire career making sure that wealthy customers got exactly what they wanted, exactly when they wanted it. "Is everything all right here?" Tony asked, his eyes darting between Richard and Lily. "Everything's perfect," Richard said with a broad smile. "I've just made a small wager with your employee here. $1,000 if she can play piano." Tony's face went pale. He knew who Richard Blackstone was, and he knew that keeping him happy was worth far more than $1,000 to the restaurant. But he also knew that his employees weren't supposed to entertain customers during their shifts. "Perhaps," Tony said carefully, "we could arrange for our regular pianist to come in and—" "No," Richard interrupted firmly. "I'm not interested in your regular pianist. I want to hear Lily play." As the conversation continued, Lily felt like she was trapped in a nightmare. The memories that she had spent 3 years trying to suppress were flooding back with overwhelming force. She could almost feel the smooth keys under her fingers, could almost hear the rich, full sound of a properly tuned piano filling a concert hall. But those memories came with pain. They reminded her of everything she had lost, everything she had been forced to give up. The piano represented a life that was no longer possible for her, dreams that had been sacrificed for more practical concerns. "I really can't," she said again, her voice barely audible now. 2,000, Richard announced, doubling his bet. The crowd around them had grown larger as word of the unusual challenge spread through the restaurant. People were pulling out their phones, some probably hoping to capture whatever was about to happen for social media. Lily looked around desperately, feeling trapped by the growing audience and the weight of expectation. She caught sight of the piano again, and for a moment she felt a familiar pull, the same magnetic attraction that had drawn her to music her entire life. But then she thought about her mother at home, probably watching television alone, and wondering if she had enough money for next month's medications. She thought about the stack of medical bills on the kitchen table, and the constant worry that kept her awake at night. $5,000, Richard said suddenly, and the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. $5,000. The number echoed in Lily's mind like a bell. $5,000 would cover her mother's medications for 3 months. It would mean sleeping peacefully for the first time in years, not waking up in the middle of the night worried about money. Tony, the manager, was sweating now, caught between his desire to please a wealthy customer and his concern about the growing spectacle in his restaurant. Mr. Blackstone, perhaps— "It's okay, Tony," Lily heard herself saying, though she couldn't quite believe the words were coming from her mouth. "I'll do it." The restaurant erupted in excited murmurs as people realized they were about to witness something unusual. Some diners pulled out their phones to record what was happening, while others simply leaned forward in their seats to get a better view. Richard smiled broadly, pleased that his gamble was paying off. He had been almost certain that Lily would eventually accept the challenge, but he hadn't been completely sure until this moment. "Excellent," he said. "The piano is all yours." As Lily walked slowly toward the piano, she felt like she was moving through water. Everything seemed surreal, dreamlike. The conversations around her became a distant buzz, and the bright lights of the restaurant seemed to dim until all she could see was the beautiful black piano waiting for her. She had played this piano before, actually. 3 years ago, when she first applied for the job at Le Jardin, Tony had asked her to demonstrate that she could play background music if needed. She had played a simple version of Autumn Leaves that day, something safe and forgettable. But tonight was different. Tonight, with $5,000 on the line and dozens of people watching, Lily knew that she couldn't play something safe and forgettable. If she was going to do this, if she was really going to sit down at a piano for the first time in 3 years, then she was going to play something that mattered. As she reached the piano bench, Lily's hands were shaking. She looked back at the crowd of expectant faces, at Richard Blackstone's confident smile, at Tony's nervous expression. Then she looked down at the piano keys, black and white and perfectly arranged, waiting for someone to bring them to life. She took a deep breath, lifted the piano bench cover, and sat down. The familiar feel of the bench beneath her, the perfect height and angle, brought back a rush of memory so powerful that she almost stood up and walked away. But she didn't walk away. Instead, she placed her fingers gently on the keys and tried to remember what it felt like to make music. Lily sat at the piano bench, her hands resting lightly on the keys but not yet pressing down. The restaurant had grown completely silent. Even the sounds from the kitchen had stopped as the staff paused their work to listen. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her, waiting to see what would happen next. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Lily stared down at the black and white keys, and suddenly she was 8 years old again, sitting at her first piano lesson with Mrs. Rodriguez, her childhood teacher who had smelled like lavender and always wore a gentle smile. The piano is not just an instrument, Lily, Mrs. Rodriguez had told her all those years ago. It's a way to speak when words aren't enough. When you play, you're telling your story through music. The memory was so vivid that Lily could almost smell the lavender perfume. She remembered how nervous she had been during that first lesson, how her small fingers could barely stretch to reach the keys properly. But Mrs. Rodriguez had been patient and kind, teaching her not just how to play notes, but how to find the emotion behind the music. From that first lesson, Lily had fallen completely in love with the piano. She practiced every day after school, sometimes for hours, driving her neighbors crazy with the repetitive scales and exercises. But she didn't care about the complaints because every minute at the piano brought her closer to the magical world of music. Her father had been her biggest supporter. David Chen worked long hours at a construction company, coming home every evening covered in dust and exhausted from physical labor. But no matter how tired he was, he always found time to sit and listen when Lily played. He would close his eyes and smile, and sometimes Lily caught him wiping away tears when she played something particularly beautiful. "You have a gift, sweetheart," he would tell her. "Music flows through you like it's part of your soul. Don't ever let anyone tell you that isn't valuable." When Lily turned 16, her father surprised her with the most beautiful piano she had ever seen. It was a baby grand, not new but carefully restored, with rich mahogany wood and keys that felt perfect under her fingers. He had saved money for 2 years to buy it, working overtime shifts and skipping lunches to put aside enough for such an expensive gift. "Every musician needs the right instrument," he had said as Lily ran her fingers over the smooth surface for the first time. "This piano will help you reach your dreams." And it had seemed like those dreams were within reach. By the time she graduated high school, Lily was performing at competitions and recitals throughout the state. Music teachers from prestigious colleges started contacting her, offering scholarships and talking about her potential for a professional career. The acceptance letter from the conservatory had arrived just 2 weeks before her father's accident. Lily could still remember the excitement in his voice when she called to tell him the news. "I always knew you would make it," he had said. "Your mother and I are so proud of you." But then everything changed in one terrible moment. A drunk driver ran a red light and crashed into her father's truck on his way home from work. He died instantly, leaving Lily and her mother alone with a mountain of debt and no way to pay for the expensive music education that had once seemed so important. The piano that her father had sacrificed so much to buy became a painful reminder of everything they had lost. Every time Lily looked at it, she thought about her father's dreams for her future, dreams that now seemed impossible. Within 6 months, she had sold it to help pay for funeral expenses and her mother's increasing medical bills. Sitting at the restaurant piano now, Lily felt all of those memories washing over her like a tidal wave. The grief that she had pushed down for 3 years was suddenly right there at the surface, threatening to overwhelm her completely. She looked up at the crowd of people waiting for her to play, and for a moment she considered standing up and walking away. She could apologize to Richard Blackstone, tell him that she had changed her mind, and go back to the safety of serving tables and staying invisible. But then she thought about her mother at home, struggling to pay for the medication that kept her heart functioning properly. She thought about the stack of bills on the kitchen table, and the fear that kept both of them awake at night wondering what would happen if they couldn't make the payments. $5,000 would change everything, at least for a few months. It would mean her mother could get the treatment she needed without worrying about the cost. It would mean Lily could stop lying awake calculating and recalculating their expenses, trying to figure out how to make their small income stretch to cover all their needs. Taking a deep breath, Lily made her decision. If she was going to play, she wasn't going to play something simple and forgettable. She was going to play something that honored her father's memory and the gift he had seen in her. She was going to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor. It was one of the most challenging and beautiful pieces ever written for piano, a piece that required not just technical skill but deep emotional understanding. It was also the last piece she had been working on before her father died, the piece she had planned to perform for her audition at the conservatory. Lily placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The first notes came out tentatively, quietly, as if she were testing whether the music was still there inside her after 3 years of silence. But as the familiar melody began to flow, something magical happened. Her fingers remembered exactly where to go, and the music began to pour out of her like water from a broken dam. The opening theme of Rachmaninoff's concerto is hauntingly beautiful, starting soft and gentle before building to something powerful and overwhelming. As Lily played, she forgot about the people watching her, forgot about the restaurant around her, forgot about everything except the music. Her fingers found their rhythm, moving across the keys with increasing confidence and passion. The technical passages that had once challenged her now flowed effortlessly, as if she had been practicing every day for the past 3 years instead of staying away from pianos completely. But this wasn't just about technical skill. As Lily played, she was pouring 3 years of suppressed emotion into the music. Every note carried the weight of her grief for her father, her love for her mother, her frustration with the circumstances that had derailed her dreams. The music swelled and grew, filling every corner of the restaurant with its power and beauty. The complex harmonies that Rachmaninoff had woven into the piece seemed to dance in the air, creating a spell that held everyone in the room completely captivated. People who had been recording with their phones slowly lowered their devices, realizing that they were witnessing something that couldn't be captured on camera. This wasn't just a performance. It was a revelation, a moment when someone's true self was being revealed through music. Richard Blackstone sat transfixed, his business dinner completely forgotten. He had known that Lily had musical talent, but what he was hearing now went far beyond anything he had expected. This was the kind of playing that belonged on the world's greatest concert stages, not in a restaurant where most people came just to eat expensive food and be seen. As the piece continued, building toward its climactic moments, Lily felt something happening inside her that she hadn't experienced in 3 years. She felt alive again, connected to the part of herself that she had thought was lost forever. The piano responded to her touch like an old friend who had been waiting patiently for her return. Every note rang out clear and true, and Lily realized that despite everything that had happened, despite all the pain and sacrifice and lost time, the music was still there inside her. It had never really left. The technical demands of the piece required her full concentration, but somehow Lily found herself able to play with an emotional depth that surprised even her. Every phrase carried meaning. Every dynamic change told part of her story. Every crescendo built toward something larger than just the notes on the page. As she approached the most challenging section of the piece, a passage that required incredible finger strength and coordination, Lily felt a moment of doubt. 3 years away from the piano was a long time, and her fingers weren't as strong as they used to be. But then she heard her father's voice in her memory, encouraging her like he had so many times before. "Trust yourself, sweetheart. The music knows where it wants to go." She trusted the music, and her fingers found their way through the complex passage flawlessly. The sound that emerged from the piano was rich and full and absolutely beautiful, filling the restaurant with harmonies that seemed to reach right into people's hearts. As Lily moved toward the final section of the piece, she realized that something had changed. This wasn't just about winning $5,000 anymore. This was about remembering who she really was underneath all the worry and responsibility and fear that had defined her life for the past 3 years. She was a musician. That part of her had never died, no matter how hard she had tried to bury it. As Lily approached the final movement of Rachmaninoff's concerto, something extraordinary was happening throughout the restaurant. The kitchen staff had stopped their work completely and were standing in the doorway, their faces filled with wonder. Servers who should have been attending to other tables stood motionless, holding trays they had forgotten about. Even the bartender had stopped mixing drinks and was leaning against the bar, his eyes closed, completely lost in the music. The transformation in the room was almost magical. What had started as an upscale restaurant filled with the usual chatter of business deals and social conversations had become something closer to a concert hall. The atmosphere was charged with an energy that none of the diners had expected when they arrived for their evening meals. Richard Blackstone watched in amazement as Lily's playing reached new heights of intensity and beauty. He had made the bet partly as a whim, partly because his instincts told him there was something special about this young waitress. But what he was witnessing now exceeded even his wildest expectations. This wasn't just someone who could play piano. This was an artist of extraordinary caliber, someone whose talent belonged on the world's greatest stages. The technical complexity of what she was playing would challenge even professional concert pianists. But Lily was handling it with a combination of skill and emotional depth that took his breath away. The Japanese businessmen at his table, who had flown thousands of miles to discuss semiconductor manufacturing, found themselves completely captivated by something they had never expected to encounter. One of them, a normally reserved man named Tanaka who rarely showed emotion in public, had tears streaming down his face as he listened. As Lily entered the final climactic section of the piece, Her playing became even more powerful and expressive. Every note seemed to carry the weight of her entire life story. The joy of discovering music as a child, the pride her father had felt in her accomplishments, the devastating loss that had changed everything, and the years of struggle that had followed. The music swelled to fill every corner of the restaurant, and people found themselves holding their breath as they listened. Some diners who had been checking their phones or having quiet conversations when the music started were now completely absorbed. Their attention focused entirely on the young woman at the piano. Mrs. Anderson, an elderly woman celebrating her 50th wedding anniversary at a corner table, reached over and squeezed her husband's hand. The music reminded her of their early days together, when they had been young and poor but filled with dreams. She hadn't been moved by music like this in decades. At another table, a young couple on their first date found themselves looking at each other with new eyes. The passion and depth of Lily's playing made them both think about what it meant to truly commit to something, to put your whole heart into pursuing what you loved. Even the restaurant's regular pianist, who had been sitting at the bar having a drink before his scheduled performance, was completely mesmerized. He was a competent musician who played pleasant background music for dining customers, but what Lily was doing was on an entirely different level. He realized he was witnessing something that he might remember for the rest of his life. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, Lily felt herself becoming completely one with the music. The physical discomfort of not having played for 3 years had disappeared completely. Her fingers moved across the keys with perfect precision, and every musical phrase flowed naturally into the next. But more than just the technical aspects, Lily felt emotionally connected to the music in a way that surprised her. She wasn't just playing notes on a page. She was telling her story through sound. Every crescendo represented her determination to support her mother. Every soft passage reflected her quiet moments of grief for her father. Every dramatic flourish expressed her refusal to give up, despite the challenges life had thrown at her. The final section of Rachmaninoff's concerto builds to a powerful, triumphant conclusion. As Lily played these last passages, she felt something shifting inside her. For 3 years, she had convinced herself that music was a luxury she couldn't afford, something from her past that had no place in her current reality. But sitting at this piano, feeling the music flow through her and out into the world, she realized that she had been wrong. Music wasn't separate from her life. It was the truest expression of who she was. All the pain and struggle and sacrifice of the past 3 years hadn't destroyed her musical soul. They had deepened it, given her new emotions to express through her playing. The final chords approached, and Lily played them with a power and conviction that seemed to shake the very walls of the restaurant. These weren't just the ending notes of a classical piece. They were a declaration that despite everything that had happened, she was still here, still fighting, still capable of creating something beautiful. As the last note rang out and slowly faded into silence, the restaurant remained completely quiet for several long seconds. Lily sat at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, hardly able to believe what had just happened. She felt drained but also exhilarated, as if she had just run a marathon and crossed the finish line. Then, slowly, the silence was broken by the sound of someone clapping. It was Richard Blackstone, rising from his seat with a broad smile on his face, applauding with obvious enthusiasm. Within seconds, the entire restaurant erupted in thunderous applause. People leaped to their feet so quickly that chairs scraped against the floor and water glasses rattled on tables. The applause was unlike anything the restaurant had ever heard. Not the polite clapping that sometimes greeted the regular entertainment, but the kind of wild, enthusiastic ovation usually reserved for the greatest concert halls in the world. The kitchen staff emerged completely from the kitchen, still wearing their aprons, applauding and cheering. The servers forgot all about their professional demeanor and joined in the celebration. Even Tony, the manager, who had been worried about the disruption to the restaurant's usual routine, was clapping with tears in his eyes. Some people were wiping away tears. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief, and still others were simply standing in stunned amazement at what they had just witnessed. The young couple on their first date were holding hands and looking at each other as if they had just shared something magical. Mrs. Anderson was crying openly, her husband's arm around her shoulders as they both continued to applaud. The Japanese businessmen were on their feet as well, their usually formal demeanor replaced by genuine emotion. Tanaka bowed deeply toward the piano. a gesture of respect that carried significant meaning in his culture. But perhaps the most meaningful reaction came from a little girl at a nearby table who had been dining with her grandparents. She broke away from her family and ran toward the piano, her face shining with excitement. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," she called out as she approached Lily. "Can you teach me to play like that?" Lily looked down at the child's eager face and felt her heart swell with an emotion she couldn't quite name. This little girl reminded her of herself at that age, full of wonder and possibility, believing that anything was achievable through music. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Lily asked, her voice still shaky from the emotional intensity of her performance. "Isabella," the girl replied. "I take piano lessons, but I don't sound anything like that." "How did you make the music so alive?" Before Lily could answer, Richard Blackstone appeared beside the piano. His earlier cockiness had been replaced by something much deeper, genuine respect and curiosity about the remarkable young woman who had just delivered a performance that would be talked about for years to come. "Lily," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the continuing applause, "we need to talk." The applause continued for several more minutes, with people reluctant to let the moment end. Some diners were taking pictures not of themselves but of Lily at the piano, wanting to capture this unexpected moment of beauty that had interrupted their ordinary evening. Finally, gradually the applause began to die down and people started returning to their seats. But the atmosphere in the restaurant had changed completely. The usual buzz of casual conversation was replaced by excited whispers as people tried to process what they had just experienced. Lily sat at the piano, still hardly believing what had just happened. 3 years of carefully controlled emotions had poured out through her playing, and somehow, instead of feeling empty or drained, she felt more alive than she had in years. She looked around the restaurant at all the faces looking back at her with admiration and wonder, and she realized that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like herself again. Not just someone struggling to survive, but someone with a gift that could touch people's hearts and make their lives a little more beautiful. The moment was about to change her life in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. As the applause finally died down and people began settling back into their seats, Richard Blackstone approached the piano with a serious expression on his face. The playful challenge that had started the evening had transformed into something much more significant, and everyone in the restaurant could sense that something important was about to happen. Lily remained at the piano bench, her hands still trembling slightly from the emotional intensity of her performance. She felt exposed and vulnerable, as if the music had stripped away all the protective barriers she had built around her heart over the past 3 years. "Lily," Richard said quietly, speaking just loud enough for her to hear, but not loud enough for the curious diners nearby to listen in. "Before we talk about the bet, I need to ask you something. Where did you train? Who was your teacher?" The questions brought back another flood of memories. "I studied at the Metropolitan Music Academy from the time I was 8 until I graduated high school," she replied, her voice still shaky. "My main teacher was Professor Williams. After that I was accepted to the conservatory, but—" Her voice trailed off as the familiar pain of those lost opportunities washed over her again. "But you never went," Richard finished for her. "Something happened that changed your plans." Lily nodded, not trusting herself to speak without crying. Richard studied her face carefully, his business instincts working overtime as he processed what he had just witnessed. He had spent decades learning to recognize exceptional talent, and what he had just heard was beyond exceptional. It was the kind of once-in-a-generation ability that music schools dreamed of finding. "I need to make a phone call," he said. "Would you mind waiting here for just a few minutes?" Lily nodded again, and Richard walked toward the restaurant's entrance, pulling out his cell phone as he went. She could see him through the large windows, pacing back and forth as he spoke animatedly to someone on the other end of the line. While Richard was outside, the other diners gradually returned to their conversations. Though the atmosphere in the restaurant remained charged with excitement, several people approached Lily to compliment her playing, and she found herself receiving business cards from people who wanted to stay in touch. The little girl named Isabella had returned to her table but kept looking over at Lily with obvious admiration. Her grandmother, Mrs. Peterson, eventually came over to introduce herself. "My dear," Mrs. Peterson said warmly, "I've been attending concerts at the Symphony Hall for over 40 years. and I've rarely heard anything as moving as what you just played. You have an extraordinary gift. Thank you, Lily replied, still feeling overwhelmed by all the attention. That means so much to me. Isabella has been taking piano lessons for 2 years, Mrs. Peterson continued, but she's never shown much enthusiasm for practice. I think you may have just changed that. She's been asking me nonstop about how she can learn to play like you. Lily smiled at the little girl, who waved enthusiastically from her table. Practice is important, she called over to Isabella, but the most important thing is to love the music. If you love it, the practice becomes easier. After about 10 minutes, Richard returned from his phone call, his expression serious but also excited. He was carrying a small envelope in his hand. Lily, he said as he approached the piano, I need to tell you something about myself. Yes, I'm in the technology business, but I also serve on the board of directors for the Whitmore Conservatory of Music. Lily's eyes widened. The Whitmore Conservatory was one of the most prestigious music schools in the country, known for producing world-class musicians and for its incredibly selective admission process. The person I was just talking to, Richard continued, was Dr. Margaret Chen, the director of the conservatory. I sent her a recording of your performance that someone in the restaurant made on their phone. Lily felt her heart begin to race. A recording? Dr. Chen has been the director for 15 years, Richard explained. She's heard thousands of auditions from some of the most talented young musicians in the world. After listening to your performance, she said something I've never heard her say before. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. She said that your playing demonstrates not just technical excellence, but a level of musical maturity and emotional depth that usually takes decades to develop. She wants to meet with you immediately about a full scholarship to the conservatory. The words hit Lily like a physical blow. A full scholarship to Whitmore would have been beyond her wildest dreams even 3 years ago, when her future seemed bright and unlimited. Now, after everything that had happened, it seemed impossible. I can't, she whispered. My mother, the medical bills. I have responsibilities. Richard held up his hand to stop her. That's the other thing I need to tell you. The phone call I made wasn't just to Dr. Chen. I also spoke with the director of my foundation. Lily looked at him in confusion. Your foundation? The Blackstone Foundation for Medical Research, Richard explained. We fund experimental treatments and provide financial assistance for people who can't afford the medical care they need. Your mother's heart condition, the medication she requires, we can help with all of that. Lily felt the world spinning around her. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. People who had been struggling just to pay rent and buy groceries. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do this for someone you just met? Richard smiled, but it was a different kind of smile than the confident, slightly mischievous expression he had worn earlier in the evening. This smile was genuine and warm, filled with respect and something that looked like wonder. Because talent like yours is incredibly rare, he said, and because I believe that when you encounter something truly extraordinary, you have a responsibility to nurture it and help it grow. He handed her the envelope he had been carrying. But first, there's the matter of our bet. Lily opened the envelope with shaking hands. Instead of the $5,000 he had promised, she found a check for $50,000. Mr. Blackstone, she gasped. This is too much. The bet was for $5,000. The bet was made before I realized I was listening to one of the most gifted musicians I've ever encountered, Richard replied. Consider the extra money a down payment on your future. Tears began streaming down Lily's face as the full impact of what was happening finally hit her. In the space of one evening, her entire life had changed. The dreams she had given up for dead were suddenly alive again, and the financial pressures that had dominated every aspect of her existence for 3 years were about to disappear. There's one condition, Richard added, his tone becoming more serious. You have to promise me that you'll never give up on your music again. The world needs to hear what you have to offer. I promise, Lily whispered, meaning it with every fiber of her being. The restaurant had grown quiet again as people realized that something significant was happening at the piano. Richard turned to address the room. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the restaurant. You've just had the privilege of hearing a performance by someone who will soon be recognized as one of the great musicians of our time. In a few years, when Lily is performing at Carnegie Hall in the Kennedy Center, you'll be able to say that you were here the night her career truly began. The restaurant erupted in applause once again, even more enthusiastic than before. People were standing and cheering, and several diners were wiping away tears. Tony, the manager, approached with a huge smile on his face. "Lily," he said, "I hate to lose such a good employee, but I have a feeling you're destined for much bigger things than waiting tables." 6 months later, Lily stood backstage at the conservatory's main concert hall, preparing for her debut recital as a scholarship student. In the audience, her mother sat in the front row, healthy and glowing thanks to the new treatment that the Blackstone Foundation had made possible. Richard was there too, along with Dr. Chen and several other members of the conservatory's faculty. But the person Lily was most excited to see was little Isabella, now her youngest piano student, sitting with her grandparents and practically bouncing with excitement. As Lily walked onto the stage and sat down at the beautiful concert grand piano, she thought about her father and the dreams he had encouraged her to pursue. She thought about the night at Le Jardin when a simple challenge had changed everything, and about the power of music to transform not just individual lives but entire rooms full of people. The program that night included several challenging classical pieces, but Lily had chosen to end with the same Rachmaninoff concerto she had played at the restaurant. As she began the familiar opening notes, she felt her father's presence with her, and she knew that he would be proud of the journey that had brought her to this moment. The music flowed from her fingers with even greater depth and beauty than it had that night in the restaurant. Every note carried the joy of dreams reborn, the gratitude for unexpected kindness, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important moments in life begin with something as simple as a chance encounter, and the courage to take a risk. In the audience, Richard Blackstone listened with satisfaction, knowing that his instincts about recognizing exceptional talent had led to something truly wonderful.